lobsters are cannibals. They like to eat each other. In an ideal world, when all the babies that hatch here at the hatchery, we would give them all their own tank. On average, 1 in 20,000 is what would naturally survive from hatching to adulthood. Some of the larger lobsters that have been found around the UK would be likely to be 100 years old or
Wow.
older because of how big they've got.
So hello everyone, we're here with the Blue Pioneers podcast, a podcast following Sea Change's adventure along the coastline of Great Britain as part of Gibber Challenge 2024. Today we're speaking with Chris Weston. He's a senior technician and education officer at the National Lobster Hatchery, a marine conservation, research and education charity based in Padstow, Cornwall, UK. Hey Chris, thank you for coming on.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting lobsters for a bit.
Yeah, first of all, what is the National Lobster Hatchery?
Good question. So we're a charity that's, as you say, based in Cornwall in the UK. We are a conservation charity that rears young lobsters through the very vulnerable early stages of their lives, and then actually releases them back into the sea in an effort to maintain a healthy lobster population in the region and area that we work in here in Cornwall.
When did it start?
So the charity itself was founded in the late 90s as a result of lobster populations declining elsewhere in Europe through the decades prior to that. Not so much here in the UK and Cornwall itself, but elsewhere in Europe. So that was one of the things that originally created the idea for the hatchery to be formed. The building I'm in now and our main site here in Padstow was actually opened in 2000, so it's purpose built as a lobster hatchery. So it always has been one. So that's been running for almost 25 years now. We celebrate our 25th birthday next year. So yeah, we've been growing these little lobsters through for a good couple of decades now, and hopefully helping out the lobster population in the area as well.
So the main goal of the charity is to sustain the population of lobsters in the area?
Absolutely, yeah. So we work off kind of three main pillars of output, if you like. So we've got the conservation, which is majoritively that rearing lobsters, releasing them back into the sea to maintain a healthy lobster population against some of the threats that they face, potentially overfishing, but also environmental factors as well. So if we can help maintain that population at a healthy level, then great. But also, whilst we've got them here, research plays a big part in what we do. So whilst we've got the animals on site, we want to be able to learn as much about them as possible whilst they're here, and education as well. So a big part of the way we actually fund ourselves as a charity is our visitor centre, but we get a lot of people through our visitor centre every year that come to see the hatchery itself, but also learn about lobster conservation and wider marine conservation at the same time as well. So through doing our kind of core process, the other things are able to happen as well as additional outputs for us as a charity. Yeah.
Lobsters are pretty well known, I think, as an animal, but so I won't ask you what are lobsters? I think that's too obvious, but what's the kind of life cycle of lobsters in a natural environment?
Yeah, so it's amazing actually. A lot of people, nearly everyone knows what a lobster is, but not many people know much about the biology of a lobster, which is obviously what we specialise in. In order to do our work, we need to know how the biology of the animals work. So lobsters they start life as an egg. So a female lobster will tend eggs under her tail. She'll carry eggs around under her tail for anything up to about 9 months or a year. So it's actually quite a long development period while they're an egg. The eggs then hatch. They will become free-floating larvae, so they just drift around. They become part of the zooplankton, drift around in the oceans for a good few weeks. Depends on the temperature of water and food availability, but generally they spend anything between a couple of weeks and a month or two free-floating and at the mercy of the ocean currents, during which time they're very vulnerable to be eaten by pretty much anything. And that's where as a lobster hatchery, we can capitalise on that stage of the life cycle, so we can look after them better in those first few weeks, eliminate the external predators here in the hatchery, and get more of them through. Because the big change happens after maybe a few weeks or a few months, again depending on temperature, etc. They will then settle out of the plankton and start to hide away on the seabed. So although they're still small at this point, maybe an inch or two long, the lifestyle change means that they're much less likely to be found by predators from that point onwards, because they're hiding in the substrate, hiding around the bottom of the sea. So the survival rate from hatching naturally to becoming an adult naturally is something like 0.005%. So that's maybe one in 20,000 lobsters will make it through with no help. However, if you can just get them through to those stages where they start to settle out, it's more like 50% from that stage onwards.
Oh my God,
so
wow.
there's a huge difference there after a few months. It'll then take them quite a long time to get from there to adulthood, so another maybe 5 up to 7 years for them to actually become fully fledged kind of breeding animals themselves. But they're much more robust after just a few months, and then obviously cycle begins again from 5-7 years old.
It takes much longer than one could think for an invertebrate to grow to an adult. 5-7 years is a long time.
Yeah, they are quite slow to mature and slow growing. They're very long lived as well, or they can be. So we know it's very difficult to age accurately a lobster, but from estimates and the way we know they grow through those first few years and a couple of decades, then some of the larger lobsters that have been found around the UK would be likely to be 100 years old or older because of how big they've got. So they're very long lived, but like you say, they take a long time to reach maturity, and that's one of the reasons that we and other people want to conserve them and are concerned for their conservation, is because of the time it takes to reach maturity. If you see a population crash or something dramatic happens to that population, it takes a long time for it to recover because of the time involved for them to replenish themselves naturally.
And do they stay reproductively active until 100 years old, or do they have a kind of menopause?
No, interestingly not. So they actually, we think, get better with breeding. At breeding with age, certainly as females, and a lot of that is to do with, I said they hold the eggs under the tail, so as the female gets larger, she's able to actually hold more eggs per breeding cycle under her tail as well. So so they'll theoretically actually get better at reproducing as they get older.
That's interesting. So we need to preserve the older, bigger females.
Potentially, yes. So there's there's a lot of legislation in place, and a lot of it varies regionally as to where you are, as to exactly what that is. But there's generally across Europe a minimum landing size for lobster. So lobsters have to be a certain size before you catch them. And the idea behind that is they are big enough to at least have had 1 or 2 breeding cycles naturally before they're able to be caught into the fishery. Now, there is an argument as well for a maximum landing size. So that you would then, if they make it through the size where they can be caught, you're protecting the older ones that are better at breeding as well. That's not been implemented in certainly many places at the moment, but there's people that are arguing for that to go alongside the minimum landing size, so we know the larger ones are able to be out there and to naturally sustain the population as well.
And how many eggs did they have? Like, I guess from the range from when they start being reproductively active to
so they so smaller females might have anything to kind of 5 to 10,000 eggs per breeding cycle, but larger females we think can have up to maybe 40,000. So a huge amount of eggs per breeding cycle once they get into those older years, and the vast majority of those eggs will make it through certainly to hatching, and she will hatch that full, or nearly that full batch of eggs as well.
I mean, you mentioned 50% survival rate in the lab, so for 20,000, was it 20,000 eggs for older?
So one on average, 1 in 20,000 is what would naturally survive from hatching to adulthood. The 50% number is an average. Again, it's very difficult to track them actually from the size we release them. So this is based on a few studies that have been done in the past on a small scale, but they which actually provided a range of data, anything from kind of 30% up to 80%, but on average about 50%. But that's just from our release size through to adulthood in the sea. So it's a vast improvement. We don't get 100% survival in the hatchery, so we will still lose some animals in the hatchery. There's various different reasons for that. So lobsters are cannibals; they like to eat each other. Now, in an ideal world, when all the babies that hatch here at the hatchery, we would give them all their own tank. But so this morning, for example, we had just over 2,000 hatching. So it's just not practical. We would need an infinite amount of space to be able to give them their own tank.
2,000.
Yeah. So, and that's one of the smaller numbers we've had recently. We've had 5,000-6,000 a day over the last few weeks as well.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, we have certain things in our tanks that are designed to keep them apart, and they're also designed to replicate the conditions they would be in naturally to some extent for those first few weeks. But we're limited that they will still occasionally come across each other. They're also molting very, very regularly. So lobsters throughout their lives have to molt their shell in order to grow. When they're very small, they're growing relatively very quickly, and they're molting their shell a lot. And the molt itself is actually a really stressful process. So some of them just won't survive molting, and then through those first couple of weeks, they're molting about every 3 or 4 days, so very regularly. So we will lose some through just not being able to be molting as well. But obviously, we can completely eliminate external predators. We can monitor the water really carefully, make sure they're provided with regular food so they can grow nice and efficiently. So, yeah, our number will be vastly greater than what would have happened naturally.
Yeah. So how do you get the eggs?
So we rely on working with the fishery. So we're unique really as a conservation method because I suppose we bridge that gap between the fishermen who, in a lot of people's minds anyway, would just want to take lobsters from the sea, and there's obviously us putting them back and people wanting to look after them. So we work with a network of local small scale fishers here in Cornwall. So we are currently working with around about 18 or so fishermen. They have to be specially licensed to bring us lobsters with eggs on. So that's where we will get our eggs from. They will catch them. We will go out to the port that they land their catch into and collect them from those fishermen. I believe it was 2017, 2018, a law came in England that banned landing of egg-bearing lobsters in order, again, as a conservation method to try and protect the natural breeding stock. So, like I say, the guys that we work with have to be specially licensed to bring lobsters to us, and they can only land those egg-bearing lobsters if they are coming here to the hatchery.
What does the license involve? Just like a training to kind of recognize females, recognize the eggs, handle them?
Yes, so well, essentially, it's given by the Marine Management Organisation here in the UK, which oversees the policing of our fisheries. So, and that is done through the local inshore fisheries authority as well. So, essentially, they're aware that these guys are fishing for lobster regularly anyway. We do advise them on how is best to keep the lobster on board the boat. We will try and certainly with eggs that are close to hatching, they're quite permeable, so we want to get those back into the hatchery as quickly as possible. So in that instance, we will ensure we collect them almost directly off the boat as soon as they come in. So there's various operational things we do to ensure the husbandry of the animals as best possible. The guys in the fisheries authorities have a pretty good idea of the fishermen that are genuinely interested, that want to help out, that have got a good record, for example, in the past of not breaking any rules, etc. So if you've broken rules in the past, you won't get a license to supply us. It is quite a lengthy process to go through, but they're on top of essentially who gets licenses. We are limited as to how many. I believe 20 is the maximum we're able to work with. And so if we have to wait for people to kind of leave if new people want to come on and things like that.
It's like a club.
Yeah, in a way,
a VIP club. How do you get the eggs off?
So we leave the eggs on the underside of the female. We have a special tank set up in the hatchery that will collect the larvae for us when they hatch out of the egg. The tank is set up so that the flow of water from our pumps and our filters moves through that tank in a certain direction. Lobster larvae, when they first hatch, we think use the moon usually in the sea as a point of reference for the surface. They need to feed quite regularly after they hatch, and a lot of the other plankton in the sea is likely to be up near the surface at night. So the hatching normally happens at night. They will use this moon. So in the hatchery we have an artificial moon, a little light up in the corner of the tank, and all the other lights are off at night. So they tend to make it move
as well across the tank.
They will quite efficiently move across towards the light, and they will then flow down.
The light doesn't move like
no. The light stays in one area because we've got a pipe that drains out of the tank, goes from there into another tank. So that's where they end up. So they will all go towards the light, go down the little pipe into the other tank. So every morning when we come in, they'll already be collected up for us in this separate tank. We have a special room next to that room where which is our lobster nursery, where all the babies will spend their first couple of weeks. So what we will do is move every day. We'll move that night hatching into its own tank next door. So we keep all of the same size animals together. Like I mentioned earlier, cannibalism, etc., means that they're not very good if you've got older animals in with smaller animals, because it just makes it more likely. So we keep all of the same days age animals together throughout the process for the most part.
So besides each other, what do baby lobsters eat?
So they'll generally eat other things that would be in the plankton. So naturally, probably a huge mixture of things. So copepod is one of the things that we'll feed them in the hatchery, but probably a variety of other larval animals that are just a little bit smaller than them. Equally, they're getting eaten by larger planktonic things than they are, as well as fish and huge basking sharks and things like that. So they sit somewhere in the middle of that planktonic food chain, probably. But we're able to feed them, other plankton, smaller plankton, copepod, etc. That's super abundant here in the hatchery. They will, we'll move on to feed them a mixture of still some kind of fish-based proteins, but also some algal-based food as well as they move through the process. And then as adults, they will. The larger adults are omnivorous. They'll eat pretty much anything, to be honest. So they will they'll scavenge for dead things that have died and dropped to the seabed. There's a lot of sensory biology about them and adaptation in order to be able to seek out smelly stuff that's on the seabed. It's one of the reasons they go in lobster pots when fishermen are catching them, because they'll taste and smell that as that wafts through the water. So, and actually ecologically, it's one of the reasons they're quite useful, because they will almost clean up the seabed and eat things that may have died and come to the bottom. But they will also eat slow moving sessile things that live on the sea. So anything that doesn't move too quickly. Obviously, as adults, they've got some nice big strong claws as well, so they can break through shells of other shellfish, mussels, scallops, things like that. But yeah, real mixture really in the diet as an adult.
Okay, interesting. And you keep them in the tanks from until what, like a few weeks old, when they start to settle? How do you check that?
Yeah, so we'll monitor them quite closely for the first couple of weeks. So the tanks are. We can see visually what's going on in the tanks there. They will molt through 3 stages in those larval phases in the first couple of weeks. So again, molting every 3 or 4 days. The water we keep at about 18, 19 degrees Celsius, which is about as warm as the seawater gets here naturally in Cornwall. So, and we found that's just a nice efficient rate to bring them through. They will do those larval phases in around about 2 weeks at that temperature. So we can get them through there. Then, now, we do have another problem, again, related mostly to cannibalism once they reach the settlement stage. So they hatch, and we call them stage 1s, and then they're stage 2, stage 3 for every molt cycle they have. So when they get to stage 4, that's the settlement stage, usually after about 13, 14 days. The problem with stage 4s is they can swim forwards. It's the only time in a lobster's life cycle where it can swim forwards. So when they're planktonic and larvae, they're just at the mercy of the currents. They can't really swim in any direction. Once they get beyond stage 4, they can kick their tails and swim backwards, as adult lobsters would do to avoid predators, or they can walk forwards, but they can't swim forwards. So stage 4 lobsters are sometimes called Superman lobsters, because they stick their claws out in front of them and they zoom around the sea, they're like Superman flying around, which is great. And that's by design, to be able for them to find a nice place to settle out on the seabed. The problem we get here in the hatchery is when they're in communal tanks at that point, they just get better at finding and eating each other, because they can swim better at their brothers and sisters, at their tank mates. So what we will do is, usually just before we see the first stage 4, around about that time, is we'll actually then separate them out into their own little compartments. We've got specially designed trays that they'll be able to go into. We pipette them out into those trays. Yeah. We'll keep them in there for another few weeks, just to ensure they're true kind of seafloor dwelling lobsters, before we're looking to then release them back into the sea.
What kind of size do they have at that stage when you pipette them out?
So they're still very small, so about a centimetre long or something like that. So yeah, they're not huge, but they look different. Kind of morphologically, they change a lot between stage 3 and stage 4. So stage 3, they look a little bit more shrimp-like. Their tails are they're curled under. The claws are kind of there, but they hang down. Whereas a stage 4 is it's almost a perfect little miniature version of what you'd expect a lobster to look like. The tail is back out straight, and it's got its tail fan, and its claws are properly developed and sticking out in front of it. So that comes at stage 4. So it's quite obvious when you see the stage 4s. It's relatively easy for us, once we get our eye in, to kind of separate out what is stage 4 and beyond from what is still a larval animal.
Back to the time it takes for the eggs to develop, 9 months or over 9 months. Is that common for invertebrates, but also commercial species, to have such a long development time?
Yeah, it is, and particularly amongst crustaceans and other shellfish. So a lot of the crab, for example, are similar time, and actually beyond the development time of the eggs, the larval phases of those animals. For example, crab, with brown crab here in Cornwall, is another commercial species, a commercial shellfish that's fished for. So very similar in life cycle in a lot of ways, but that they actually have a slightly longer development time and the time from as planktonic animals, and the larvae are actually even smaller as well. So the process that we operate for lobster could theoretically be applied to something like crab, or actually a lot of other marine species, because they follow broadly the same structure. There's egg in a very vulnerable stage, and then they become bigger and more robust at some point. It's just at what point does that happen, and how practical is that to be able to keep them in an aquaculture facility whilst they're in those vulnerable stages? So something like crab, for example, it probably is possible at some point, but you'd have to refine the design, something around what we do, but tweak it in order for it to actually work efficiently. And because the larvae are so much smaller, even just designing a tank with a mesh that will contain them in the tank but allow water to flow through is difficult, for example. So I'm sure it's something that will be done in the future, and there are people that are attempting it, I believe. It's not something I don't think we completely rule out doing and expanding into other species, but obviously for now lobster's the thing, and it's what we're good at, so we're focusing on lobster. But although they're very vulnerable for the first few weeks, and we have to be very, very precise about monitoring water quality and making sure the husbandry is spot on, it actually it's relatively easy to do with lobster compared to some other things that might also be able to kind of have a similar process applied to it at some point.
So meshes is how you change the water for water quality without taking out the larvae.
Yeah, so we have our tanks are designed. They obviously have water. The water's recirculating through our systems constantly through filters to keep the water clean. Water obviously goes into the tank, and that needs to return to the filters. So yeah, we have a mesh that will catch, it will allow the water through, but stop the animals going out. But it will also catch excess food and things like that. So we can clean it regularly. It helps keep the water clean.
Yeah. So it definitely has to be a fine line. To not capture the larvae, but capture everything. Oh,
exactly. Yes.
Capture the larvae, but not anything else that needs to go out.
Capture the larvae, but also allow enough water through, but not clog up with either baby lobsters or excess food and stuff, because then obviously the water level will rise, and then you'll flood the hatchery. So yeah, it's a process we've refined over the last couple of decades to try and get that as efficient, get enough water exchange, but also be able to contain the animals, etc. Yeah.
How many tanks do you guys have?
Good question. So we have 3 tanks that are set up just to hold the expectant mums, so that the females waiting to hatch. So we have 3 of those, and a couple of those are kept at a different temperature. So they're on a separate system. We have temperature controls on all the tanks. So the eggs will develop more quickly in warmer water, more slowly in cooler water. So we can adapt to have. For example, if we have a lot of animals hatching in the hatching tank, then we can keep some back and they'll develop slightly more slowly. We don't want to alter that too much because it will alter the development of the animals. But to within a couple of weeks or so of that 9-month period, we can kind of stagger our hatching if we're clever about it. So we've got 3 of those tanks plus a couple of extra storage tanks for adult lobsters. The larval tanks, we have around about 18 of those. So that's generally, like I say, about a 14-day process. So we need at least 14, but it is nice to have a little bit more capacity. For example, where we get days that are very, very high in terms of larval numbers, we might split the batch into 2 if we can and spread them across two tanks. So about 18 of those cones plus 4 or 5 of the cones will put the trays in as well. The tanks will put the trays in to keep them until release size. So yeah, it's a decent amount of water and a decent amount of lobster. We did a very broad brush calculation the other day of how many lobsters we could hold if you took into account all of the babies, and we had 5,000-6,000 a day plus all the mums that we had plus all the ones we were waiting to release, and it was well up into tens of thousands. I think it wasn't far off 100,000 animals we could have on site at any one time that we were responsible for.
Is summer the season that you get not pregnant, but egg-carrying females?
Yeah, mostly. It is seasonal, but we're able to operate year round. And
Yeah.
some of that is down to kind of say temperature control. So some of our larvae are able to hatch a little bit early in the year than they might have otherwise. So most lobsters will hatch here in Cornwall from anywhere between kind of March through to kind of September, October.
Okay.
Having said that, we have had some lobsters from the fishery that have come in say December that are ready to hatch. So it's
Wow.
not completely unheard of, but yeah, the majority, and actually, we're just coming through our most busy period now. So May and June really is the real peak of
Uh-huh.
hatching generally. But we will see hatching throughout the summer and throughout the year to some extent. Yeah.
And you tag the individual lobsters to be able to follow their reproduction?
We can't tag the ones that we release
Yeah.
because they're still so small. So or
Oh yeah.
because there are ways of doing it, and that has been done in the past. That's how we've got the survival rate from
Mm.
what should survive from the size of lobster we release at. But this involves inserting a microwire tag in under the shell because they molt
Ooh,
the shell. You can't put anything on the outside of the lobster because you'll
of
just lose it
course.
after a few days, few weeks. So it has to be done internally, which because it's so small, so niche, is extremely difficult to do physically, but B, it's quite expensive as well because the
Yeah.
supply and demand. Not many people make these things, and they're quite
Yeah.
hard to get hold of. So
Yeah.
um, it's not something we can do routinely, unfortunately. It would be really nice if we could, but practically we can't, unfortunately. That's why we rely on data from previous studies where there have been catch and releases and they have been able to do this. We get a lot of anecdotal evidence from our fishermen that we work with, for example, where they are seeing lobsters in areas where we've done previous releases, and the size of lobster that they're reporting ties in with what we know about lobster growth rates from when the release happens. So
Cool.
we're very confident that what we're doing is working. The next stage, I suppose, in that process would be to get some more definitive numbers on survival rates of the animals we're
Hmm.
releasing. The way we'd probably have to do that is through genetics. So
Mm.
we do actually take a couple of egg samples from each lobster that comes through the hatchery and have done now for a good several years. It might even be up to 10 years now. So we have essentially a genetic database in our freezer of all the lobsters that have come through here in the past decade. So the next stage
Amazing.
from that will be to go out and look at lobsters that are now being caught into the fishery and look at their genetics and compare them to what's in our freezer and see what the
That's so
likelihood is that
cool.
they are a product of the hatchery or related to, and down the line.
So yeah, you can identify literally the offspring of the individuals that you
Yeah.
held.
And obviously that again, expense wise, is going to
Yeah.
be hugely expensive, and you'd have to certainly to get an accurate number to say we have released this amount of lobsters, and so we have supplied X% of the population, whatever, would have to be done on a very large scale to get enough data to kind of validate that. So I think that is a project. That project is in the pipeline, but it's as and when that will happen will be largely funding dependent for us and
Hmm.
staff availability and stuff like that. But that will be hugely beneficial, I think, to us and to kind of general lobster hatchery knowledge if that can come off at some point.
And the females, can they bear eggs multiple times in the year? The same female?
Yeah, so we've seen. It's interesting this one. We're not entirely sure, but we have seen lobsters come to us, hatch a batch of eggs, and then lay another batch of eggs.
Wow.
Yeah, we know they can definitely have multiple. So they generally have one molt. We thought anyway, one breeding cycle between molts, and an adult
Uh-huh.
lobster will molt depending on its age between every year and every 3 years maybe. So they will. But like I say, we've seen some that have what we call reburied. So they're called buried lobster when they got
Oh,
eggs because
okay.
the eggs look a bit like berries here in the hatchery. So we know that they can mate with a male and store sperm. So we assume that
Mm.
they've stored sperm for that potentially that whole first
Batch.
development period, and
Yeah.
then refertilize another batch of eggs, which is quite impressive. So we know they can molt with multiple males, so there can be kind of mixed paternity, and they will potentially have multiple batches as well, I think.
Do lobsters live all around the UK?
Yes, yeah. So we are. So I should have clarified really at the start that we only work with one species, which is the lobster people recognise as a lobster. It's the main species of clawed lobster here in Europe. So it's the European lobster, Homerus gammarus is its Latin name, and that we exclusively work with that animal. We have other animals here on display in our aquarium tanks, but generally that's, in terms of the hatchery, that's the only animal we work with. And that species ranges from Norway in the north, right down the western coast of Europe, a little bit into the Med as well, and down to even North Africa, Morocco, the very north of Morocco.
Oh, wow.
So we are here in the UK, right in the middle of its range, really.
Yeah.
So yes, you will find it right around the UK. It's a little bit habitat dependent. They tend to like rocky reef structures generally, where there's places to hide away. They're mostly nocturnal in terms of their activity, so they'll generally hide away in the day and then come out and forage and things at night. So where there's areas of reef and weed cover and things like that, they really like, which Cornwall and the peninsula we have down in the southwest here in the UK is very good for, and that's one of the reasons the population here is strong, and obviously as a result the fishery here is strong because the animals are here. But they are found right throughout the UK, and especially into Ireland as well, a lot of the similar habitat. But there are areas on the east coast, southeast, and Scotland as well. You'll find them all around. Yeah.
Are you the only lobster hatchery in the country?
Not the only one, no. So we are one of a few. There's, I believe, we're one of the only ones that operates year round. There's a couple of others based around the country. One on the Edinburgh at the Firth of Forth in Scotland, for example, that operates seasonally. So they'll operate throughout the summer. Similar concept, but again, just operating locally to their area. There's also quite a bit of interest in a few others that have starting up now recently. So we've had a few people contact us looking for advice on starting them. So I think as a concept, it's certainly taking on, and that's great. Depending on the scale you do it, you will affect a certain area. So potentially you could get a scenario where these lobster hatcheries pop up locally in areas that require them, where lobster fishing is higher, for example. Again, it could divulge into other species at some point as well. So yeah, it's nice to see it happening in other areas as well. We have our main site here in Padstow in Cornwall. We have another small hatchery down in Newlyn that runs on a kind of project basis. We're doing a lot of our research down there at the moment, actually. But the concept of that, because it's actually in shipping containers, so we've got the same setup, but in shipping containers, they're all properly insulated and air conditioned and everything. But because it's shipping containers, it's potentially able to move. So you don't have to have the planning permission and everything you have with buildings, such as our main site here. So theoretically, that could react to areas that required lobster punishment at some point and could potentially be moved.
And because it's a species that's already widespread, you don't need any kind of biosecurity. It's not going to be invasive because it's
so
the UK is like in range.
Yeah, we are monitored. So we're monitored by CFAS, which is the fisheries and aquaculture branch of the government that govern all of that. So we are licensed by them to run a lobster hatchery. So we have to abide by certain biosecurity measures, and they inspect us yearly to ensure we're adhering to all of that and ensure the husbandry is all good. So that all of that stuff would apply as it would to any other lobster hatchery. But you're right. While we're only working with one species, it's relatively simple. I mean, we have to, for example, some of the things we'll do is we'll disinfect lobsters as they come out onto the site to ensure they're not bringing anything in from the sea. Obviously, a lot of things they might be able to deal with in the sea if they're in a more confined environment might be worse for them biologically. So we're quite hot on biosecurity anyway in terms of our animals. We'll actually do that a couple of times during the process as well, so that if there are any problems, it's hopefully isolated to one area of the hatchery as well. And again, we're obviously responsible in that we are putting those animals back out into the sea. So we want them to be healthy animals when they go back out into the sea and not have been at any detriment during that time.
How do you what do you say? Clean them?
Yeah, so we disinfect them. Just it's essentially a bleach, but it's very, very mild. So they're only in it for a short period of time. So it's in seawater. So we just put them in essentially very clean seawater for an hour or so, which will allow them to hopefully remove any toxins that would have been on them when they were in the sea or in any of our facilities.
Interesting, because in native oyster restoration, they also bleach, a mild bleach solution. They also bleach the oysters when they import them from somewhere else to then put them back out. So it's interesting that they. Oh, I just turned on. It's interesting that they survived that.
Yeah, like I say, we're only putting them into a very short period of time. They're also not feeding at all. Oysters are slightly different in they filter the water, which potentially has a bigger impact. Whereas the lobsters are essentially just sitting in it for a short period of time. We'll when they're being fed, for example, they will just be in natural seawater. They won't be anything like that. So they're not ingesting any of that water as such. Yeah.
Cool. And I assume there's like a set of criteria that the environment has to have for the lobsters to be released. Like if you have a site that's really polluted, it may not be beneficial to try and restore the population.
Yeah, so we'll generally go off habitat. So that we know that the really important thing for them when we're releasing them at size, we're releasing them, there's lots of places to hide, basically, because if they don't find anywhere to hide, then they're not going to stand much of a chance. And that's a far bigger concern than pollution initially. If there's concentrated pollution in that area, that will definitely be an issue. So yeah, trying to avoid areas certainly with maybe sewage overflow, runoffs, and things like that. In Cornwall, for the most part, they tend to be in a lot of sandy areas anyway, so beaches and places where that effluent will run off, which isn't ideal lobster habitat anyway. They tend to like rockier areas, so that's not a huge concern. We do have to be really careful, actually, more so in terms of the lobster hatchery water that we're getting in for the hatchery in terms of pollutants. We're based on the River Camel, so it's an estuary, so we get seawater, and we're able to get seawater from just outside the building. But the Camel itself has a very large catchment area, so we're always very careful about withdrawing water from that after heavy rain, for example, after there's been runoff from the farmland, etc. So we tend to not use water if at all possible around times of heavy rain. We only strict criteria on terms of the timing and the tides that we use as well. So we'll only abstract water on an incoming tide, for example, so that we're getting seawater rather than river water going the other way, again, to reduce any input from kind of runoff from the land and rather get it from the sea. So that's a big consideration, really, with the water in the hatchery, because that's the water they're experiencing when they're molting very regularly, and they're very, very small animals. So that's when they're most likely to be affected by it as well.
And lobsters as a commercial species, what's the kind of importance there?
So lobsters are very valuable, and it's not one in terms of its weight. It's not caught in anything like the numbers that some of the whitefish are, for example, here in the UK and in Cornwall. But for its weight, it's very valuable. So I believe in the latest data we have in Cornwall, it was around about 300 tons of lobster caught, which equates to about £4.4 million, I believe it is, something like that. That's just Cornwall alone. So it's a very important component of the guys that are fishing for its catch. Generally, and a lot of the people we work with will be catching maybe lobster, crab, and maybe some species of fish as well. But it's usually a relatively large part of their income is lobster specifically, if that makes sense. So it's important financially for the people that are fishing for it. Certainly the smaller scale guys are the ones we're working with. But I think also kind of culturally in Cornwall, shellfish fishing, lobster has a place as well. It's like I said earlier, the geography of the area, the habitat means it's always been good for lobster, which means lobster and potting has always been traditionally one of the bigger forms of fishing here in the southwest. And because of that, obviously you've got small quaint fishing villages that have grown up around that industry. And I think a little bit more holistically, but knock on from that, and that a lot of the tourism now in places like Cornwall and the southwest are people coming to visit it because it is quaint and pretty. And yes, we've got nice beaches as well, but people come to places like Padstow and small harbour towns because it's nice. And that is essentially all a result of the small scale fishing industry and mostly shellfish fishing. So culturally and financially, I suppose it has been or is an important icon or species as well for the fishery and the area.
Was there a time where it became evident that there was a need for an intervention to maintain the numbers?
So I think I mentioned very briefly earlier, but the lobster collapse, particularly in Scandinavia from the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, we know was down to overfishing. And that was something that had been observed here in the UK. There'd not been any sign that was going to happen initially to the UK, even though the fishing level was similar, I believe. But then during the 90s, I believe there was a slight dip in the lobster population here in Cornwall, the lobster catch. So that was kind of the spark, I think, that went, oh, hang on, maybe we should be a bit proactive here and try and avoid this happening. Because, I mean, it took a very long time to replenish to anything like the previous number of catch that they were seeing in Scandinavia once that collapse happened. So it was actually the chief fisheries officer at the time here in Cornwall was who implemented the hatchery, or the idea, and got the ball rolling with the hatchery. So he was involved with policing the fishery essentially and making sure everyone was playing by the rules. But he was obviously very clued up in what people were catching and what the trends were at the time. So he was one of the people, and it still works with us today, as one of our trustees.
Oh wow!
In terms of getting this place started, that was really the kind of the reason we started in the first place. Yeah.
And what was the evolution of the measures taken? If I think of it, I would think the first thing to do is, okay, don't catch but release the females that carry eggs. That would be the most obvious. So what were kind of the evolution of the measures?
So I mean, there's always been some level, and again, this varies a lot regionally. There will always have been some legislation in terms of protecting the natural stock. The measure you mentioned there didn't come in anywhere around that time where there's any concern. That only came in literally a few years ago. But things like the minimum landing size has been around for a lot longer to allow those. So it was initially more measures like that allow them to try and keep replenishing themselves naturally. And that's, don't get me wrong, it's still a huge benefit to conserving the population. We're only a part of that, and we almost complement all of the other stuff that's out there as well, I think. But yeah, so initially, ideally, maybe put some preventative measures into the fishery. It really depends on the level of fishing that's happening, how much your stock has deteriorated as well. But that will also affect how big a hatchery operation, for example, would be required in order to help things. So at the scale we work at, we are much more of a proactive, preventative measure. We're not releasing anything like the amount of lobster that's being caught into the fishery in Cornwall. And that's probably the way it should be. That's because the other legislation that's maintaining the population naturally is doing some of that work for us. So theoretically, our hatchery could be, and part of the benefit of us doing what we do is, in theory, could be scaled up to actually restock a fishery should it need to. But we're not at that point yet, and hopefully won't be at that point. We are hopefully just able to maintain that population at a healthy level alongside the other legislation that's in place, rather than having to go to those desperate measures. And that's why I think you just do it little and often is better than just letting it completely go and then having to rebuild from nothing.
Yeah, I find it interesting. Conservation it's kind of a mix between protection, but also it seems more and more like active restoration or some kind of proactive activity, not just protection, like release the egg carrying females, don't catch it below this size, but it's more and more made up of restoration as well.
Yeah, and again, I think with that, the answer is probably balance and a mix of both, isn't it? In terms of having those things going on in the sea that are going to maintain some kind of natural stasis, but recognizing that in places where the fishing pressure or whatever it is very high, then some additional help might be beneficial as well. I think that in terms of our work and aside from purely releasing lobsters in order to help maintain the population, like you say, the fact that it's a proactive method of conservation and also that it's happening on land, I think is really beneficial because it allows people to actually see it happening. I think certainly with marine conservation, a lot of it, if it is purely the element of protecting things through legislation in the sea. First of all, that's very difficult to police, and not everybody is going to abide by those laws, and it is very difficult to make sure everyone is doing it correctly. But But secondly, by doing it on land, I think we open up a conversation with people that otherwise might not have even been aware there were issues, or even really aware of anything that was going on in the sea. So I think, again, harder to measure from our perspective, but by having this land-based method of marine conservation, aside from the benefits of working with the fishery itself, we hopefully provide a bit of a window into that world that people wouldn't have got involved in or wouldn't have understood those issues. And at the end of the day, if they don't understand there's a problem or see it and find it interesting, they're not going to want to go out of their way to protect it at all. It's quite part of my role is, alongside making sure the lobsters are okay, is doing school visits and education visits, and it's quite nice to see kids and also kids have never been near the sea before. It's amazing for them to see a lobster up close, and the change they go through from coming through the door, not really knowing anything, to going away and being excited and enthused about it will hopefully stick with them in years to come. And then somewhere down the line, they might make a decision about something they're going to eat or the way they're going to vote in something, and it might just change the way they think about the world or what they prioritize. I don't know, but I think certainly with marine stuff, it's a lot of it does have to happen in the environment, whether that's restoration and or legislation just stopping you taking stuff or whatever it is. But hopefully by having some stuff that provides that window into that world as well is beneficial in bigger picture terms, I suppose.
So at the hatchery, visitors can have a look at the lobsters when they're tiny plankton. Is there microscopes?
We're unique really in that we're one of the only kind of labs that you can really see working. But so you'll see all stages of lobster life cycle, really, from the mums with the eggs through to the babies, the larvae, through to kind of release size animals, and then back to kind of adults in display tanks. They'll see it all. And they say school visits and stuff are good. We do, depending on size of groups and stuff, we can do behind the scenes stuff where they can go and actually kind of see it all up close and stuff as well, additionally to what the average visitor would see.
What's the questions that kids ask most often about lobsters?
We get some good ones actually. Normally stuff around like how long can they live? How much could they hurt you with their claws is quite a good one as well. Quite a lot. I got pinched the other day actually and got a cut on my arm. We're normally pretty careful with it, but there's the odd one that will get you if you're not quick enough or if they're quicker than you. So it's quite.
That's the pregnant mothers.
Yeah, well, this was one of our. It's called a colour morphs. It's a weird colour, a bright yellow one that we've got in the moment in one of our display tanks, which is that one. Yeah, so she managed to get me the other day. But the kids are good, and they're normally they normally like the more grotesque facts as well. So the fact they like to eat their brothers and sisters is normally quite a good one. They can self-amputate their legs and their claws and grow them back. So usually to escape a predator or to get out of a molt or something like that. They pee out of their faces, usually to communicate with other lobsters and stuff. So they like all of that stuff. Yeah. So there's some pretty cool lobster biology that can get them interested. Yeah.
And Chris, how did you get into lobsters and into conservation?
So I studied zoology at university. I've always had an interest in the natural world generally. I had always liked marine stuff, but I wasn't entirely sure which direction I wanted to go in certainly when I started university. But I was based in Cornwall at university, and obviously living in and around the marine environment kind of got me hooked. So I tended to direct a lot of my studies towards kind of marine biology related stuff. And I actually volunteered initially, but then worked at one of the local aquariums here as well. So that I think the balance of doing the academic stuff around zoology and then the kind of technical, practical stuff, working in the aquarium, learning how filters and the tanks work and everything, actually provided me with quite a nice balance of everything I need in my role today. And I worked at the aquarium for a year or so, and then there was an opportunity. Initially a part-time job came up at the Lobster Hatchery. I'd always had an interest in the kind of native side of marine life here in the UK as well, so that kind of suited my interest in that as well here. So it's a mixture of the conservation and the skills I'd learned from the aquarium, so I've been able to combine those quite nicely in my role at the moment. And I've been working with lobsters for seven years now. Wow,
that's the time it takes for a baby to become an adult.
Exactly. So my lobster career is an adult lobster now. Yeah.
Maybe some of the babies you released when you just started, or maybe
should hope be adult lobsters now. Yeah.
What's your favorite fact about lobsters?
Um,
Or your favorite thing about them?
yeah, I like that they stick up for themselves. Then they don't mess around. Obviously, they've got the claws that help with that. They definitely tell you who's boss. When, like, for example, me getting pinched the other day was a good example of that. I like that they stick up for themselves. But I do like the fact that they can self amputate limbs and grow them back. Is pretty cool. Like, just to decide you need to. If you want to escape a predator, it's fine. A little bit like a lizard or a reptile would do. You can leave their tail behind. If something catches them, they can do that and grow them back. So I think that would probably be up there, yeah.
How long do you keep the adult lobsters in the tanks for?
Really depends on what stage how long the eggs have still to develop before they're going to hatch. So some will come in almost or even hatching as they come in. So they may only be in the tank for maybe a week or two. So that's generally how long the eggs will take to hatch. Others might come in a good couple of months or so before they're ready to hatch. They might be with us for kind of 6 months or so.
So in that time, do you kind of notice a change in the behavior as they get used to you guys that feed them?
No, not that I've seen. They're pretty similar. Like I say, they're pretty feisty. Normally, they will stick up for themselves, and they are still very much like that once they've hatched their eggs, and actually a little bit more so sometimes when they've hatched the eggs because they're no longer tentative about or worrying about losing eggs. They'll actually a little bit in terms of obviously they see us as probably a potential predator. They'll actually probably react more so to us once they've been with us and have come to the end of the hatching than they were when they initially came to us. Yeah.
And do different lobsters have different temperaments? Are some shyer or more aggressive than others?
Yeah, it's really difficult to say. I would, although there's definitely you definitely do see a difference between individuals. Whether that's that personality per se or whatever is impossible to say, but you'll definitely see different energy levels from different lobsters. It could be a lot to do with the way they've been transported. So we obviously have control once we get them, but they've been caught and have spent some time on the boat. The temperature of water they've been in we know affects their metabolism, and so how fast they'll react to things. But yeah, food, how long since they've eaten, for example, which when they first come in, we don't know. So we definitely do see a difference in the kind of energy level when we're handling them when they come in. But yeah, hard to say what that is due to, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Wow, fascinating. We're getting to the end. So I just want to have you tell us where people can follow the hatchery's work.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, like I say, we're a charity, so we rely on people being interested in our work to function. So it'd be amazing if nationallobsterhatchery.co.uk is probably the kind of central place online to go and find all of our stuff. But we are at Padstow Lobster on social media as well. So Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, we're definitely involved with. If you'd like to come and see the lobsters yourself, we are based in Padstow. So, I mean, all the information for that is on the website anyway, but open year round, every day apart from Christmas Day. And then if you can adopt a lobster, we have a gift shop, and you can actually adopt a lobster on the website as well, which essentially just helps us cover the cost of a lobster going through our process, but you get to name the lobster and you find out where it's released as well. So we have lots of cool little schemes like that, and businesses, we have schemes that we work alongside businesses as well. But again, all the information for that is on the website, nationallobsterhatchery.co.uk. But yeah, support is much appreciated to help us get some more little lobsters through and back into the sea.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for your time. It was amazing hearing about lobsters, and I learned a lot. And also amazing to hear about the great work that the hatchery is doing to restore the populations. No
problem. Thank you for having me. Apologies that the Padstow didn't work beyond Padstow for the boat. I mean, it's at least yes. hopefully we made it as far as the lobster hatchery, so all is well. But hopefully some boat repairs can be made and get back on the sea soon.
Yes, yeah. Actually, the team when they stopped in Padstow, they adopted a couple of lobsters, and they named one after me.
Awesome. Yeah, that's like I say, the adoptions is good because it's and it's great actually as a gift as well. So if you've got a name, you can name it after someone as a gift for someone else. It is perfect because it's like they exist as one of our lobsters and go back out into the sea as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.